the beecroft's always fine.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we check out the Belasco Theater, 44th Street, New York, 1941. Bitter William is back in this chapter, and he's got a bone to pick with Lee Shubert, manager of the Belasco Theater, which was briefly renamed the Saroyan Theater in 1942. But there's a fair bit of context to unpack in this chapter. Saroyan name drops a lot, and it's not entirely easy for a modern audience to follow it all unless you are steeped in Broadway history. Let's start with Lee Shubert, as that's where the chapter starts. It begins, Lee Shubert was a thin little man with a parchment face and a very soft voice. I learned later that he was the sharpest money boy around, sharper even than Billy Rose and Billy's bitter enemy Mike Todd. Schubert was a wealthy theater owner and one of the first investors to make Broadway sparkle in the early 20th century. Lee and his brothers, J.J. and Sam, built their empire first by acquiring theaters in upstate New York. Eventually, they challenged A.L. Erlanger's theatrical syndicate that had a monopoly on bookings across the country, and they won. So ruthless were the Schuberts that they were a leading cause for creation of the Actors' Equity Association. By 1924, the Schuberts controlled 75% of American theaters and produced 25% of all plays. When the Great Depression hit, they were encouraged to sell their theaters. However, they didn't. And even if they were horrible people, this action kept Broadway alive. Eventually, in the 1950s, antitrust laws forced them to relinquish some of their monopoly. Lee Shubert was known to favor money and popular content over artistic cultural content. So this is where he butted heads with Saroyan. Ironically, Schubert had also been a newsboy and had also married, divorced, and remarried his own wife. Now, to go back to Billy Rose and Mike Todd, these were theater producers in the 1930s and 40s. Todd first gained wealth by stealing an adaptation idea from a Chicago stage and bringing it to Broadway, and then to the 1939 World's Fair, where he challenged producer Billy Rose's World's Fair exclusivity contract and won. So anyone who knew about theater in the 1940s knew about Billy Rose and Mike Todd and their feud. And so the comparison to Lee Shubert is right off the bat filled with negativity about money and greed. Saroyan hated Hollywood, but there were plenty of nasty producers on Broadway too. He then jumps into the accusations that Lee Shubert enjoyed the favors of a wide variety of young women eager to go on the stage. There are few first-hand accounts of the sexual abuses happening in the Schubert theaters, because the voices of women have historically been silenced. But the memoirs of choreographer Agnes Demille and dancer Dorothy Bird, decades after the acts, tell the story of the harassment against female actors and dancers that was rampant in the theater world. Demille revealed the explicit nature of these demands. The business manager, since deceased, I did not care for. It is the custom to speak kindly of the dead, but having entertained nothing except loathing for him when he was alive, I see no reason now to veil my opinion. He it was who set the dancers' salaries, $35 a week and a little loving on the side. Plain and frank like that. Dorothy Bird's memoir, Dancing with Martha Graham and on Broadway, and Agnes Demille's memoirs, Portrait Gallery, and Dance to the Piper, share such experiences and reveal that dancers were treated little better than prostitutes on Broadway in the first half of the 20th century. Other people's memoirs probably reveal that the same behavior was occurring in the second half of the 20th century and on as well. It went beyond the Schuberts, and Saroyan is rightfully airing a bit of industry dirty laundry here. And then Saroyan describes the Belasco Theater, where he was given a run for 6 of his plays. He directed and produced with his own money, not trusting any of the industry men to do it right. And he mentions that the Belasco itself was named for David Belasco, a flamboyant man of the theater, sometime playwright, and god of trash, that is to say, a hero of the theater and its crowd, always an odd lot. Belasco had an apartment above the theater where he kept historical furniture, props, and Japanese erotica, and where he would seduce women of the theater. He sold his theater to Schubert in 1948. Saroyan didn't think much of Belasco, but never knew him personally. In obituaries, he wrote, "And of course, David Belasco was a kind of attractive fraud in the American theater, and wore a collar backwards, and did the book of an opera by Puccini, The Girl of the Golden West or some such. Taking over the theater made me think about the old boy, but not really seriously. The theater was big. If you filled it, you had a hit. My plays never filled it, and indeed the second balcony was always shut off from the rest of the audience. Only I spent time up there during a performance, and with me, most likely, hundreds of the ghosts of good people without lots of money, who over the years had paid as little as possible to get into the theater and see something more of the Deacon David Belasco of San Francisco." He describes Belasco and Schubert's peephole that they used to keep an eye on the performers, ever the masters of their domain. He explains that the place was haunted by a fraud who never suspected as much, and by his banal ideas and his gorgeous women and girls. The first thing a man ought to have in the theater is an insatiable capacity for enjoying the favors of desperate women. The haunting here refers to Belasco, who was said to haunt the theater until his ghost was banished by the risque production of "Oh, Calcutta." He describes Mr. Schubert's feet as narrow and in very tight, highly polished, expensive shoes. You may recognize this observation from chapter 20, where he talks about the highly polished and narrow shoes of the owner of his 3rd Street penthouse building in New York. There he wrote, "The owner had very new, very narrow, very highly polished shoes on his feet. This business of the narrow shoes, highly polished, is worth a moment longer. Such shoes are worn almost as a religious rite by an order of man of the world who may best be described as a self-deceived success." This shoe business is becoming a real theme with him. Although he accuses Schubert of taking advantage of women, Saroyan also describes him as dainty and having a soft voice, his effeminacy juxtaposed with his desire to control and own the bodies of his employees. Saroyan is perhaps suggesting that he is overcompensating. Schubert welcomes Saroyan, saying, "I want you to know how pleased I am that the Saroyan Theater is to originate at the Belasco. Any way that I can help, I'm at your service. Go in there with a free heart. Don't worry about business matters." But that wasn't what he meant at all. Saroyan was planning to show plays every 2 weeks, cycling them out and then moving them to other theaters. It opened with Across the Board on Tomorrow Morning and Talking to You. To follow were Afton Water, Jim Dandy, Get Away Old Man, Happy Birth, Decent Funeral, and Elmer and Lily. These others, however, did not premiere at the Belasco, given the mixed reviews and low income from the first 2 showings. He hired an authentic taxi driver, a harpist, an eccentric poet from Greenwich Village. He was taking chances and exploring avant-garde theater at a time when it wasn't quite popular on Broadway. Indeed, experimental theater increased in the late 50s and 60s, as always, ahead of his time, and Schubert counted on box office hits, not cultural expansion. The plays were box office bombs, and despite Schubert's smooth words, Saroyan was kicked out of the theater due to low box office intake. The sweltering August heat overcame the ancient cooling system in the theater, and audiences were uncomfortable even before the plays began. This was a blow to 33-year-old Saroyan, high on the critical success of the time of your life. Saroyan would never find the same success as that again, but he kept writing for the theater, despite finding it harder and harder to find producers and venues. In letters from 74 Rue Tabu, Saroyan explains that Across the Board was an anti-war play, but the war had already started, and it was too late to be anti-war. He says that during rehearsals, he was called to pass an army physical at St. Joseph's, and of course, Saroyan kept writing anti-war pieces, notably The Adventures of Wesley Jackson during the war, and drew the ire of the United States Army. Theater was a passion of Saroyan's, so it was a big blow when he found himself unsuccessful in the genre. The Belasco fiasco weighed heavily on Saroyan, as we can see in this chapter, and he often called out the evil moneymen for his failures, still steaming from the necessity to make money from art, which he hated, and which was the reason he refused the Pulitzer Prize in 1939, claiming, "Wealth, I am sure, cannot patronize art, and the strange impulse of wealth to seek to do this, I believe, is a curious example of noble bad taste." This is a chapter about disappointment and resentment, and although nobody really comes out smelling fresh in this chapter, it's an important piece of the Saroyan emotional puzzle that he carried with him forevermore. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.